This video is a quick review of when to choose v and when to choose na. Remember that v and na, their usage depends on whether you're talking about in what place, где, versus towards what place, куда. So with где, when you're talking about in what place, you use v or na plus prepositional, whereas when you're talking about going towards a place, v or na plus accusative. So for example, он был в магазине versus он идет в магазин. Она была в библиотеке versus она идет в библиотеку. But how do you know when to choose v or na? Sometimes it's in versus on. So here's an example. Бумага в книге. The paper is in the book versus бумага на книге. But obviously, in most cases, we're talking about at a place rather than in versus on. When we're talking about at a place, being in a location kind of thing, our default is v. It's more common to use v. So when do you use na? You use na when it's an open space. Some examples of this are stadion. Discoteca, I guess it's the floor is open, kind of. You're on the floor rather than being in a place. Dacha, I guess because it's got a garden and it's outside. Pochta. Someone told me, I don't know if this is true, but someone told me that it used to be that the post office was outside, which maybe would explain why it's na. But it's not park. Park, we use v for park. Na is also used when it's an event. So for example, работа, I'm going to work. Я иду на работу. Because your work is more like an event. It's like, let's say, maybe like you're a construction worker and you don't work in the same place on any particular day. It's more like an event. Similar to that, concert, an event. Lekcja, an event. You also use na when it's a smaller part of a bigger whole. And our first example here is kind of a politically charged one. Ukraina, Ukraine. For many years, Ukraina was considered a smaller part of the bigger whole of Russia. So many Russians use na Ukrainie. However, many Ukrainians prefer that you use v Ukrainie, because then that sounds like it's its own thing rather than a smaller part of a bigger whole. Another example of this is Alaska. Alaska is kind of separated from the rest of the United States, but it's part of the United States. So it's used, na is used with that. Kamchatka is a part of Russia that's got kind of a similar thing. And sometimes na does not make much sense. Like for department or faculty of a university, kafedra, fakultet, they're both na. Why? I don't know. Maybe it's because you're not in any one specific room. I'm not sure why. So there are some that you just kind of have to memorize. So let's try a few. V ili na. Pause and think about whether you think you would use v or na in these instances. The bottle is on the table. Бутылка на столе. This is an in versus on thing. We live in a dorm. В общежитии. It's just the default. We are going to an opera. Мы идем на оперу. Why is it not here? Because it's an event. Were you at the post office? Вы были на почте? Remember we said почта as maybe an exception, or because historically it was outside, if that's true. We saw them at the store. Мы их видели в магазине. Just the default, no reason not to use v here. The pen is in my bag. Ручка в сумке. Here it's an in versus on. They live in Ukraine. This one's controversial. Some people would say, они живут в Украине. Some people would say, они живут на Украине. Does it say anything about your political views if you use one or the other? I'm not sure. It's an interesting question. I go to the park every morning. Я хожу каждое утро в парк. Remember park, even though it's outside, for whatever reason, we use v.